Delighted to say I'm joined live by Ger Canning, famous commentator within Ireland, done God knows how many All-Ireland finals at this stage. It must be 70 odd, Ger, is it? Can we just go back?
I think at last count it was 77.
That's an incredible
But
record.
that included Shane doing the first three in Irish. Now, they were live. I was back in 1991, I did the two, and then I did the football in 94 as well. RT had this brainwave that they had RT2 available. So why not use it? It was fairly straightforward, simple broadcasting. So Michael O'Hare did the All-Ireland finals in English on RT1, and I was sitting next to him, next booth, doing it in Irish as best I could. So that's how I started.
Yeah. So, but you were a teacher before you ever got going as a commentator. Is that true?
Now, that's true. That's true. I taught for a few years, enjoyed it enormously, taught in Cork, and at one stage I decided let's try something different, and saw an ad in the paper for newsreaders. And I said, something, I might fancy just having a go at that. I was really hoping to try and do sport, but I knew of one or two other people who had gone from one department into another, and I thought maybe that was possible. And there was a guy called Jim Sherwin. Jim was a rugby commentator, but Jim started out as a newsreader. So his path to sport was through news. So I took that on board. And I applied for this job. About 900 applied for it. I was lucky enough to be in the last 5, so we all did the training. The first job, they were going to give 2 jobs from the 5 of us. First job went to a man called Cyril Smith, who had been working for UTV in Belfast. So Cyril became a newsreader with RTE, and they offered me a contract as well. And I was humming and hawing over it, and in the end I said, I really want to do sport. Is there any way I could do sport out of news? And they made it plain, look, there's no way in the world. So while I was there training, I met a young producer who was bound for the Cork studios. And he said to me, look, if you end up in Cork and you want to do some radio, link up with me. His name was Pat O'Donovan. And between the jigs and the reels anyway, he got me into sport, and he got me working out of the Cork studios together with the head of radio in Cork, a wonderful woman called Maradona. So they gave me a chance, and that's how it started.
Did you very much take to it like a duck to water, or did you have a couple of scary moments when you first started out? Because it can be unnerving just sitting behind a mic.
Well, it's very unnerving because when you start first, if you're totally new to this thing, it's very daunting and it's claustrophobic. A studio can be extremely claustrophobic, and I experienced that, I must say. Morny Warriku, the head of radio, she got me into doing a children's radio program on Radio 1. There was only Radio 1 at that stage. It was 1978, the year before 2FM came along. So it was a half-hour program every Wednesday afternoon called Young World. Young World, I think it was called. And I did it for 14 months, and it was a great training vehicle for me. But I did find it exceedingly tense and claustrophobic, as I said. And you're worried about making mistakes. And then I went to do sport out of that shortly afterwards. And you're wondering, Shane, okay, a hurling or football match at club level, which is where I started, is 60 minutes long. So that's 60 minutes talking. And you're wondering, how in the name of blazes am I meant to keep going for that length of time? I had no real interest or intention in becoming a commentator. What I really wanted to do was do match reports. I thought that would be a brilliant job. You could go along to a couple of matches at weekends, do your inserts, do your match report at the end, and you'd never have to work. And it would be great fun. And that's what I really wanted to do. But there were no vacancies for that.
There's so many things I want to chat to you about. But can I start off, first of all, in your own background in sport? Like when you were a young guy, you're from St. Finbarrs, and you would have played minor with Jimmy Barry Murphy, although I think he's a couple of years younger than you.
He is a couple of years younger than me, and he's a great guy. Do you know something? When I met him first, he was about 14 or so. I was probably 17. And he never changed. He was always a lovely, nice young fellow. And he's still a nice young fellow, I can assure you. He just never changed. He's a smashing lad. One of the greatest players I think I've ever seen play, He was just magical, absolutely magical. Yeah, I played with the Bars. And I played more football than hurling. I would love to have been a better hurler, but I just don't think I had the wherewithal. I can remember practicing. I mean, nowadays most clubs, as you know, have hurling walls. So young lads are there and they're belting the ball right and left and so on. I remember my mother went out to work after my father died, and I was she was only whatever age she was. I was only 7 at the time anyway. But I remember when I was about 12 or 13, and going to a secondary school called Coláiste de Criasserie, which was a wonderful hurling and football nursery. And I remember one Wednesday thinking, I really must practice my hurling. And what I did was I went out the back. It was an ordinary small back, but there was a wall and a hedge in front of it. The wall was built by my late father. The hedge had been grown by my mother. So I decided the hedge had to go. So I got a saw and I chopped down the hedge. And now I had a perfect wall to go and practice my right and left-sided hurling. And then I needed a goal, so I went and I got the fire guard, and the fire guard became my goal. So she came back. She took it in good part, I must say, but it never improved my hurling very much, I have to be honest, you know.
Yeah, I think most kids have a couple of silly stories of things they got up to in their pursuit of sport. You would have played other sports too, I presume, because you're not just a GA commentator. You've done World Cups, Olympics.
Yeah, I played an awful lot. I played an awful lot of soccer as well. When I went to UCC, one of the things that appealed to me, I have to be honest, when I was playing hurling and football, we trained, as you know, for about 3 to 4 weeks. A championship match comes along, you win it or you lose it. If you win it, you're still in business. If you lose it, you've got to go and look for something else to do. But when I went to UCC, I decided, look, I want to do a few other things. So I joined up the soccer club there. And that straight away meant training Tuesday, training Thursday, match guaranteed every weekend. Usually Sunday, but sometimes Saturday. And sometimes in UCC, we didn't have enough players to cover the different teams. So a few of us played under assumed names with certain other teams there. And we just about got away with it. But we had a fantastic time. And I ended up playing with in our Munster Senior League team. And I went on then to play for a while with College Corinthians. So I enjoyed myself. I wasn't a very good player, but I was very enthusiastic, you know.
So when you got to initially doing county finals and stuff like that with RT, and then you were promoted up to your first All Ireland was in Irish, wasn't it?
Yes, 1981. I really only did my first TV match in 1980. I started in radio in 78, and somebody heard what I was doing and said, would you come up and we'll have a look at you and all the rest of it. And they tried to introduce me to television. They tried to explain to me how a match is edited so that I would know where to pause and what they were looking for, the differences between a radio commentator and a TV commentator. And, you know, I thought radio might be a possibility, but they said, no, we've plenty of people for radio. We don't need you. Well, we do need maybe somebody to come in and do TV. So that's what they trained me for, essentially, you know.
Is it? I mean, they're probably worlds apart in terms of you have to be give an update on every single play when it's radio, whereas the picture does a lot of the talking with TV.
Yes.
Do you think a good commentator at radio should be able to port over to TV and vice versa, or is it not as simple as that?
I think it's a very, very difficult thing, and every time I do it nowadays, I have to kind of have a little chat with myself and say, now, hang on, this is a totally different discipline from what you have been used to doing. One of my first bosses was a man called Tim O'Connor, and Tim was famous within the service. He was my boss for about 15 years. He had a belief that it wasn't tenable, that you could do both. And he really did not want it and was very much against it at all times. But I think some of the other bosses who came in said, well, hang on a while, we have a certain number of personnel, let's use them, let's see how it'll work out. And it has worked out pretty well in most cases, you know.
How different is it being a journalist now versus when you started out? Because, you know, I mean, I'm live streaming here and I'm my own production crew while I'm chatting to you as well. So it's quite different to when you started.
Listen, you are so technically advanced, I can just about turn on the mobile phone. I'm not joking you. It was not part of my DNA. I didn't grow up with this stuff, you know. When I started out first, Shane, there were no mobile phones, for starters. There was no internet. So if you can picture a situation, go back 40 years, go back to 1980, when I started TV first. I had just got married, and I came back from honeymoon, And we went to my now mother-in-law's house because she had a telephone. And she said, somebody has rung you in the last week and they want you to go to Croke Park this afternoon for a National League quarter-final between Galway and Waterford. So I'd arrived back in Cork early morning, 8, 9 o'clock Sunday morning. The match is that evening in Croke Park. I'm 2 weeks married. And somebody has said to me that they want me to go up essentially to do a trial, but they were going to use the commentary as well and maybe put out 3 to 4 or 5 minutes of it on the late night sports program that night. So I rang up the number that I was given. I said, look, there's no way in God's earthly world. I've been traveling all night. There's no way in the world I'm going to be able to go to Croke Park. But they allowed me to delay my introduction for another week or two. But I do remember when I did my first match, which was a league final replay in Páirc Uí between Limerick and Cork. There were 8 goals in it. It was won by Cork, as I say, after a replay. Well, the following week, I was given a match to do between Offaly and Laois in Portlaoise. This was a first-round Leinster Hurling Championship match. I had never been at a first-round Leinster Hurling Championship match before. I'd heard one or two of the Offaly names, like Pádraig Horan. And this was the year, bear in mind, that they won the Leinster Championship for the first time ever, that 1980 season. So I remember we were living in Whitechurch. We had just built a house. And I remember going down to the local kiosk, the telephone kiosk, with a whole lot of coins. We had no telephone at home. And I put the coins into the telephone. I phoned up whoever the secretary was in Laois and again in Offaly to get the teams, to find out who's who and what's what. And I can remember going to Portlaoise and meeting up the Offaly team in the Kileshin Hotel at lunchtime that Sunday. So I had some kind of a hold on them and some kind of an idea where they were and who they were like and where they played. I knew very little about Laois. I was going on the numbers essentially. And I thought, you can get away with that. My God, was it a lesson. It was the biggest, hardest, toughest lesson I ever got. It was only match 2 in my television career and nearly my last one. I remember it very well. I was in Portlaoise. We were up on an embankment in a scaffolding, in a little box, and it poured rain. There was one monitor in front of me. There were 2 cameras covering it, one going wide, one going tight. And I was trying to follow it on the monitor, which was a new experience completely for me. I was trying to see out, but you couldn't see out because the rain was lashing against the glass of the little box. And I made a total dog's dinner of it. I was driving home afterwards saying, I hope to God somebody, probably from an illegal organization, blows up every transmitter in the country to take all the television stations and services out of action for the night, because I am after disgracing myself. I remember talking to the man who was in charge afterwards, and I said, look, I couldn't see out. And he said, well, why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you actually sit down and say, I cannot physically work within these conditions? And I learned that lesson. And the following week, I was still doing the match on the Sunday. This was the beginning of the Sunday game series now in 1980. And the first programme was a game in Thurles between Waterford and Clare, first round of the Munster Championship. So I'd learned my lesson from the previous Sunday. And I got into the car on the Tuesday and I went to Waterford. And I went into the car again on the Thursday and I went to Clare and I sat there in the stand and I learned who those players were and I did my homework. And I realised from that time onwards, you dare not do a match without your homework properly done. You'll flounder if you do.
Because you could do 69 minutes of a match impeccably and then you could get one mistake wrong, just say somebody's the usual free taker when it might be somebody else. You could make one little misstep and people hammer don't they?
That's exactly it. That's always been the case. Listen, you're never more than about 5 seconds away from a disaster, When you open your mouth, you have to activate your brain as well. I learned that much. I can remember doing a game in Croke Park. It was a game between Galway and Tipperary. And I was in full flow and it was a very good game. It was good and pacey stuff and I was really enjoying it. And I meant to say that such and such a player hit a short pass. But what came out of my mouth was not a short pass. It was a word that begins with S and rhymes with white. And it was that kind of a pass. And I suddenly realized, oh my God, this was live. Ah, horrible.
These things happen. I have a question in on Twitter from it's from David O'Brien. What was the most boring game you ever commentated on? I don't know if anything springs to mind.
Not particularly. I do remember Cork playing Limerick in a football match, which we covered live. It was Billy Morgan was the manager at the time. Oh, when would it have been? It wasn't in Billy's first time as manager. In other words, pre 1990. It was probably after that, and it was a pretty dull game. And I remember thinking, it's time to hold hands and try and make contact with the living, because it was a shocker. But I remember Billy saying to me afterwards, it wasn't that bad, And they did go on to beat Kerry, I think, in the subsequent Munster football final. So they were a team on their way,
So
you get a few like that, Shane. You get a few like that. But by and large, there's always something there that's going to be something that you can enthuse about. You never know when you go out on a Sunday or a Saturday when you're going to see the best goal of the season. It won't be an All-Ireland final now. It could be a first round, it could be a National League game. It could be the best goal, the best save, the best pass, best piece of defending, greatest fielding in the middle of the field, or if it's hurling, the most skillful play that you've ever witnessed. You never know when you're going to see it.
I have to ask you, of course, about some of your famous phrases, and I might even take the liberty of trying to take you off a little bit, saying, stymied this time, once again, minimum effort, maximum care. Where did all of these sayings come from?
God only knows. As I say, you open your mouth and you don't know what's going to come out sometimes, It's live broadcasting. It's what happens. I suppose you can become imprisoned by your own phraseology. You shouldn't be. I try to go back and I try to listen back to the stuff afterwards. And if something is overused, I try to eliminate it, if at all possible. It is very important to go back and watch your own stuff. I was given a piece of advice once by a commentator in Australia, Dennis Cometti. Dennis retired a couple of years ago. He was the number one commentator for Channel 7, I think it was, and doing all the AFL finals, the grand finals. And he said to me, I'd advise you, if you follow my lead, he says, try not to listen too much to other commentators, because what you'll end up doing is adopting their phraseology. And it's probably good advice,
There's obviously another stock phrase that you use, and the earliest version of it that I could find on the internet. I'll just play it for you now and then give me your reaction to where this came from.
Okay.
Towards Larry Tompkins, trying to get a bit of latitude, and he's kicked it delightfully.
It is, of course.
There was a crowd in Limerick, a musical group in Limerick, who did some song about that, and it was brought to my attention, yeah. I guess the word latitude, some people think that latitude only has to do with longitude and latitude. But it means literally being given space and room in which to maneuver. I don't think I've used the word too often in about the last 10 years. That was a Larry Tompkins phrase there, wasn't it? And Larry was one of the greatest players, that ever played Gaelic football. I wonder, do people around the country realise just how good this guy was? When I was talking to you there a little while about my first year in TV, which was 1980, RT decided in 1980 that they would introduce a program called The Game on Monday. It was kind of a repeat of what went on the previous night in the Sunday game, but they wanted to put in a couple of extra pieces into it, some added dimension. So they got me to do a lot of the minor games that were done in Croke Park and elsewhere. So I ended up doing a lot of those games in that first year. And that's where I saw Larry Tompkins for the first time. He was a minor with Kildare in 1980. I remember him playing against Meath. And he remembers it as well, I know. But I do recall I was coming back from a game at the beginning of 1987, and I met a guy called Seamus Coughlan. Elsewhere, he'd be probably called Coughlin. Sadly, Seamus died a few years ago. He was a lovely, lovely guy. He was an All-Ireland winner with Cork in 1973. Played with Nemo Rangers, was working in the army, later worked for the Cork County Board. A smashing lad. He was at school with me in Coláiste Chrisree. And I remember meeting Seamus, and he said, did you hear the good news, the big news? And I said, what are you talking about? He says, did you realise Larry Tompkins and Shea Fahey are both going to be playing for Cork? And I thought, wow, this could be a game changer. And it proved to be. I mean, from 1987 through to 1990, Cork enjoyed fantastic football success, and they were two marvellous players.
Yeah, I actually did a piece with Liam Hayes recently, and he was talking about how unbelievable Larry Tompkins is. There's one other piece of commentary that I had to ask you about. It's a beauty. I'm just going to play it now. You probably know what's coming.
It's 21 points to 20 in Waterford's favour. And I hope you're good at the maths from here on in. I was missing from school the day we were doing counting. I was out with a hamstring injury to my mouth.
Sorry about that. I was enjoying that game. That was a fantastic game. It's been shown quite a lot recently on different TV stations.
Yeah, it's Cork Waterford 2004 for anyone who isn't sure.
That's where Waterford beat Cork for the first time in the championship in Yonks, as far as I can remember. And one of the things, Shane, when you're looking back at we used to call them on TV the Wrinklies, that is the old matches. When you're looking back at it and you're looking for maybe a new dimension or a case of, well, why did that happen, or why didn't that or this happen? Do you remember just before John Milan was famously now sent off? It was at the beginning of the second half of that game, 2004 Munster hurling final in Thurles. And Waterford had been awarded a free in the middle of the field, and Ken McGrath was standing over it and about to take it, from which, incidentally, I think they scored a point. Not directly, but I think Seamus Prendergast won possession and put it over the bar. Now, just bear with me. So, Ken McGrath standing over the ball, there's going to be a free to Waterford. It's about 3 minutes into the second half. Suddenly, an off-the-ball incident, and John Milan is deemed to have fouled Brian Murphy, and John sees a red card, and Waterford are down to 14. And then the free is taken. And then I'm sitting all these years later, and I'm saying to myself, should the referee have actually thrown the ball up and cancelled the free in Waterford's favour? Waterford got a point from it, and of course Waterford won by a point in the end as well. So there you are. Talking point. Is it the time to replay that final from 2004?
Get all the boys back out of retirement and go again. Wouldn't it be great to see? Do you have any particular game that where, I suppose you're trying to contain yourself, you're trying to project the excitement, and maybe sometimes you get carried away. Sure, Jimmy, Barry Murphy, some of your other club mates would have been playing in some of these big games, but have you ever found yourself almost getting taken away by the occasion?
Sure, you're always getting away in some respects, I just find sport incredibly exciting. And this is not a fake thing. This is me. This is what I am. This is what I'm most interested in life outside of my family, clearly. And I've always been that way. From the time I was a kid, I lived in sport. I guess it probably came back to the time when, my father died, as I mentioned to you, when I was 7 years of age. There were a couple of sports fields near us. There was a soccer field just 100 yards up the road, and then there was a GAA field about another 100 yards beyond that. So they were the places I tended to spend my life. They were my playgrounds. That's where I spent most of my time. That's what I was interested in. And therefore, it was inevitable, when it was possible to get a job and work in sport. I'm envious of fellas like yourself who can play hurling at a very high level and can perform so admirably. I mean, it's something I can't do, so I can stand back and take great pleasure and enjoyment in seeing what you're able to manage. It's phenomenal. It's just phenomenal, Even during this current national, global crisis, I've been enjoying things like, Sunderland Till I Die on Netflix, for instance. I don't know if you've seen it or not,
yeah,
but it's a very interesting set of programs. And now I'm watching the Michael Jordan one and the Chicago Bulls, The Last Dance. I think I've seen the first 4 episodes. I think that's all that they've produced up to now. And again, it's terribly, terribly interesting being able to see from the inside something like that happening,
And I have another comment in from Oisin Murphy saying, what was your favourite sporting moment to commentate on? And he loved your commentary for Canning's winning point versus Tipperary in 2017. As a tip man, I didn't enjoy it too much myself.
That was a particularly great moment, I have to say. I admired Joe enormously. We're not related, incidentally. As far as I know, we're not related. Although way back in my background, there was a Galway Dimension, but I still don't think we are related in any way, shape, or form. But he's such a hurler. He's incredible what he's able to do, and he is the mainstay, isn't he, of that Galway hurling team still. And if we do have some intercounty action before the end of this calendar year, I mean, how Galway will do will depend so much on how Joe performs. He strings it together. I enjoy all aspects of all games. I'll be honest with you. Games that stand out. There are so many. A lot of it has to do with rivalries in the GAA, as you know only too well. If you're in a parish like where you came from, it's the rivalry with the next parish. Or in my case here, the neighbours down the road, the teams that play against one another and the crowds gather in. In hurling and football, from the 4 decades that I've been involved, I've seen the great rise. I kind of came in at the back end of the Mick O'Dwyer v Kevin Heffernan Dublin Kerry rivalry. Then you went on in football to the Meath Cork rivalry. At the same time, you had Tipperary emerging at that stage in the late 80s under Babs Keating and what he did for Tipperary hurling and for hurling in general. Tipperary had gone, 16 years, I think it was, or was it more, 1971 to 1989, whatever number of years, that 18 years since winning the All-Ireland, and then suddenly you get to that stage where remember the day, maybe you're too young, the day that Tipperary won back the Munster Championship in Killarney, for instance. That was in 1987. Nicky English, Pat Fox. You had fantastic games at that stage. You couldn't, if you were a scriptwriter or a film producer, you couldn't produce that epic drama. This came naturally from the players, from within the players themselves. And it showed what winning meant to them and performing for their counties meant to them. It was just phenomenal stuff,
Have you been watching back a lot of the games from previous eras that have been on TV recently on different channels? And even,
I've been watching a certain number of them, yes.
Because I'm
trying to keep up with them.
A lot of it would include your commentary. So would you be listening to your voice and think, my voice has changed over the years? Or would you have liked stuff you did back then or disliked it?
I'm always interested to know at the time when I'm looking at the matches, who was the co-commentator working with me. So up would pop Mick O'Dwyer, for instance, or Jack O'Shea, or Tomás Mulcahy. And then there were certain matches I did, and there was no co-commentator. And I'm there saying to myself, I wonder why there wasn't anybody working with me that day. And it kind of dawned on me, different producers had different ideas about what they wanted from the production. So some wanted a co-commentator in those days, some didn't. Nowadays, it's taken as a normal, everyday broadcasting experience that you will have a co-commentator because two voices are always essential, always important. The commentator's job essentially is to reinforce for the public what the public can see in the pictures. It's up to the co-commentator to explain why it's happening and to give a kind of a professional evaluation of what's going on, because the co-commentator has played at that level, the commentator hasn't.
And if you go back to your first All-Ireland in 81 when you were commentating in Irish, could you sort of describe the amount of preparation you did for that? Because, you see some commentators now and they'd have a big page and it's all kind of marked out with different players with a huge amount of information with them. Is that how you would operate?
I would always advise, at one stage over the last 20 years, I worked for a short while in a college where they were training radio and TV broadcasters, would-be broadcasters. And one of the pieces of advice I've always given them was write down stuff on a piece of paper before you go in to do anything, whether it's live or not, because you never know when you're going to require that piece of paper. Your mind can go completely blank. It can happen to anybody at any time. I mean, all the politicians, they're reading speeches off auto cues. Very few nowadays just go and do it off their head. So it's important for all broadcasters, sports broadcasters, I think in particular, because sport is unrehearsed. We don't know what's going to happen. We know how it's going to start. We have an idea when it will finish. We don't know what's going to happen in the middle of all of that. So I will always write down an awful lot of stuff in advance. I would spend most of the week working on a game. You may say, what would you do? I remember doing Premier League soccer for RTE for quite a large number of years. And at one stage, RTE bought into a package which was available for BBC and for Sky. It was a company in England producing about a 40-page dossier for every Premier League match, giving every piece of fact and information that you could require. It would do a large paragraph on each one of the players. And bear in mind, you didn't know who was going to be playing. So a squad of maybe 20 players. So that's a lot of reading to do. And there's an awful lot of stuff in it. When he's got his last goal, who he played for last, a whole load of stuff that you'd hardly think about. And I tried to bring that into what I was doing. So I began writing paragraphs on every player as well, because I think it was important to get into the game from an early stage in the week, rather than wait for the teams to be announced on the Thursday night or the Friday night, or God knows they mightn't be announced at all. But you must have some idea going in there about what's going to happen in the game, or have an idea of how it might work out, how it might pan out. And you do that by going through all the individual players, the possible matchups and all the rest of it, and get under the surface of the game. That was the important thing, you know?
So I found that the difference between doing something live, as we're doing right now, versus showing up and writing a match report as a newspaper journalist, is that you can actually just show up 2 minutes before the match as a newspaper journalist, because you can kind of figure it all out later. What was actually relevant there? What do I need to know about, and study it? Whereas when you're doing live, you actually have to have all eventualities covered and almost think about how you're going to ask the questions. But I don't know if have you ever done any print?
I have done a little bit, but not an awful lot. I wouldn't have considered myself a very good writer. I like writing, but I'd be pretty critical of my inabilities, to be brutally honest with you. Then again, when I was at school, I told you that at the beginning of this piece that I got into sport through a competition for news reading. When I was at school, I couldn't read at all. When the teacher used to ask us to go reading passages from the text, I dreaded it, because I was waiting for the mistakes. I had so little confidence in my ability to read. I was just waiting to fall over the words and make a complete and absolute dog's dinner of it. But it's like all things, Shane. It's like all things. As you get older, you develop a degree of confidence. And the more often you do something, the more practiced you become in trying to achieve some degree of excellence at what you're supposed to be able to do. I guess it's like a young fellow riding a bike for the first time. You look at the bike, it's got 2 wheels. Technically, you should fall over. But amazingly, once you start to practice and once you go out pedaling, the bike keeps going and you stay upright.
Very true. What were the other non-GAA sports like to cover? Is there a particularly memorable... Did you go to World Cup 82 maybe? Or have I that wrong?
No, you're right. That was my first World Cup. I've done quite a few World Cups, I'm glad to say. The last one was in Russia 2 years ago now, isn't it? 2018. My wife was making out there one day. She said, I think you've covered 14 different sports. That's one of the great things about working for RTE. It has been an absolute joy and a privilege, and I was just so lucky. You see, when Olympics come along, they ask you, well, would you consider doing this, or would you consider doing that? So I would have done Olympic Games. I've done a lot of Olympic Games. In the last Olympic Games, I did the Irish hockey team when they were performing, the men's hockey team playing in the Olympics, or performing in the Olympics for the first time in a long, long time. I would have done basketball, volleyball. The most awful sport I think I did for TV would be water polo. I did one water polo match, and it was the filthiest, dirtiest, most awful game I've ever in my life seen. It was the final day of the Olympics in Barcelona in 1992, and it was Spain against Italy. And I knew very little about it. I was doing a lot of other sports as well. I was doing Olympic handball at the time, and God, you name it. I was doing about 3 or 4 different sports. But it was a wonderfully enjoyable experience, except for that last day. This was pretty much the last event before the final curtain came down on the Olympics. So you turn up at the pool. It's blazing heat. You're depending on the monitor. The sun is shining down on the monitor, which is making it quite difficult to see it clearly. I thought, I'll surely be able to identify these fellas. but they've only got caps on. The number might be on the cap, so you're trying to figure out where the ball goes. You're trying to avoid using silly phraseology like the goalkeeper is having difficulty with the greasy ball, and a few other ones like that. And then you begin to see underwater shots, and there are guys scratching one another, and the fouling that's going on underneath the water. It was hideous. Hideous.
Would you have? I don't think you commentated on it, but would you have been there for Michael Carruth winning gold in '92?
I tell you what, I was in an arena with a producer, Kevin Cullen, and we were in another arena in Barcelona. We were covering the Olympic handball final, and it was going to happen in about half an hour. So we sat there watching the monitor, watching Michael Carruth, and it was an absolutely glorious moment. I mean, this was 1992. There had not been an Olympic gold medal for Ireland won since 1956 and Ronnie Delaney. So it was an amazing moment. Speaking of Ronnie Delaney, he is hale and hearty. I have 2 grandchildren in Dublin, twins, Ethan and Ben, and we had them out for lunch about 3 months ago in a restaurant in Dublin, and they're only, they're now 3 years of age, but there were only 2 at the time, and I spotted Ronnie Delaney away in the corner chatting with an old friend of mine called Peter Byrne, former journalist, and went over to Peter, and Peter introduced me to Ronnie, and I said to Ronnie, will you come over and do a photograph with my grandchildren? He was delightful. He was wonderful, and he is in great form, marvelous sportsman.
And I suppose you've obviously met and interviewed many very famous journalists at these international sports events. Would anyone that you've either seen play or interviewed stand out?
Oh gosh, I remember meeting Franz Beckenbauer. Jimmy McGee introduced me to him. I was fortunate enough to work with great people like Johnny Giles, for instance. I mean, Giles was a wonderful footballer. An awful lot of your audience right now will not remember John in his heyday, but he was a magnificent midfield player for Leeds United and for Ireland, and he was manager of the Irish team at one stage. He was a league winner with Leeds United, and it's so sad to hear of the death today of another one of his former colleagues, Trevor Cherry, from that great Leeds team at the beginning of the 70s. Last week, Norman Hunter lost his life, unfortunately. And I remember working with John one night in Elland Road. It was a Monday night, and Leeds were playing Spurs, I think, in a replay of a cup competition. And John came up to me at the commentary position. He said, "You won't believe this. There are fellas downstairs who won't let Norman Hunter into Elland Road. He doesn't have the right pass, and they don't know who he is." It was from a different generation. It was sad, and he was very saddened about it because he had a great time for Norman Hunter.
Absolutely. Who would have stood out for you in terms of co-commentators? Actually, that's probably an unfair question because you don't want to pick anyone in particular, but you must have had some great moments and relationships with these different co-commentators.
I did. It was a pleasure working with all of them, I have to say. Nowadays, I'm working with the likes, I have worked with Martin Carney for a long time. Martin's a great guy. We did an awful lot of matches together from 1993 onwards, I think. Latterly, I've worked with Desi Dolan and I've worked with Kevin McStay. They are guys who are able to bring a new freshness to the commentary situation because Desi was playing up to quite recently at club level. Kevin has been managing Roscommon, so he brings that dimension into it. And then on the hurling side of things, you've got Brendan Cummins, you've got Michael Dignan. Of course, I worked with Michael on so many All-Ireland finals, and he's a magnificent commentator, really is. I've enjoyed all of their company, and they've all given an insight into the game that I didn't have. They bring something to bear on the match commentary, which the commentator can't possibly bring.
Sort of a tongue-in-cheek comment is after coming in from Killian Fair saying, who's the most impish player you've ever seen?
Joe Brolly. The man who blows kisses to everybody, or used to anyway. I saw that, you mentioned it at some of the old games. I watched again recently the 1994 match between Derry and Down. I don't know if you've seen it or not.
I was watching it last night.
It's worth seeing. It's a brilliant game. It's an absolutely brilliant game. I remember an old friend of mine, Jimmy Smith. Jimmy was the captain of the Armagh team that was beaten in the 1977 All-Ireland final against Dublin. And Jimmy became the commentator for BBC for a long number of years. He was working on that game. He would still regard that, I think, as the best game that he's ever worked on.
Did you ever come away from a game thinking, oh, I've absolutely nailed that one there. I got that just the way I wanted to. I found the perfect pitch?
No. Hasn't ever happened. Hasn't ever happened. I still am striving to try and get that game where I come away saying, yeah, that was it. That was it. I don't think it'll ever happen. It's a bit like writing a book or writing an essay. You'll always be going back saying, couldn't I have done it differently? Couldn't I? Not sure about that opening phrase. That doesn't work. That adjective is not the right one, you know. You'll never hit perfection, unfortunately, ever. Not for me anyway.
Do you would you sort of script lines for, let's say, someone scores a particularly good goal or something like that? Because I get the sense that with a lot of Premier League commentators that they've almost scripted a line if someone scores or based on a certain eventuality before the game ever even starts.
I don't. I do a script in advance, which I have to produce for RTE, and that is the scene set so that they know where they're meant to go, and I'm meant to know where I'm meant to go as well. This is the opening bit that we do before the match commences. After that, I think, apart from the notes that I write on each player, and you know, there's a saying in our business, of all the stuff, of all the material that you've prepared in advance for a game, if you use 5% of it, that's about as much as you're going to use. You know, you never know who's going to score. You never know what's going to happen. You might have a big load of spiel on some player. He could get injured after 3 minutes and be gone from the game, you know. So it's part and parcel of the business. You have to do the preparation. If you don't do the preparation, you will be found out. And you're not serving yourself, or more particularly your audience, as you should, if you don't do your homework. All the guys that I work do. They work really hard.
Is there any particular qualities that make up a good commentator? The preparation seems like that's a prerequisite before you even do anything else, but is there anything that you think these are the traits you need?
That's your phone, not mine, I hope. Traits that you need. Okay, I think the most obvious one, and there was a young lad on the phone to me last week. He was a second-year student in Mayo in a secondary school, and he said, I want to be doing your job. How do I do it? So I said, well, look, the first thing you need to do is get to enjoy your sport and play a lot of sport and get a lot of sporting experiences, listen to an awful lot of people about how sport is coached and developed and so on. After that, it's being accurate. Be as accurate as you can. That's the most important possible thing that a commentator should have, accuracy.
Is there a game that you ever missed for, I don't know, maybe you had a flu or something like that, but is there a game you ever missed out on for any sort of a reason where you were like, I wish I was let commentate on that game, or that I could have?
No, touch wood, and I'm touching a piece of wood now in front of me. I've only once ever had to not work on a Sunday, and that was when my mother died. Apart from that, I have had good health, thanks be to God, and I've got to be where I wanted to be for all of the matches. Were there matches I'd love to have done? I'm sure there were, but we share the workload. I mean, that's the way television stations work and media operate. You know, no one person could do everything. So no, I've enjoyed what I've had to do, and please God, it'll continue.
Absolutely. Actually, would you have done some of the World Cups and watched the likes of Maradona play?
Yes, I saw Maradona play as a very young player in 1982. He was with the Argentina panel, and I saw him play against El Salvador when he was about 17 or so. He was added to the panel because he was a marvelously talented footballer. And I remember I was with a producer called Julian Davis, and Julian and I worked together on the World Cup in Spain in 1982. And then we had a day off, and I don't know where we were. We might have been in Valencia. And he said, "Look, there's a match tomorrow involving Argentina and El Salvador. Will we go watch it? The Maradona's playing, and a few of the other great players. I mean, Argentina had been the world champions from 1978 in Argentina. So by 82, they were still the defending World Cup champions. So we wanted to go see it. So we drove down to, I don't know, Alicante or someplace. And we had our passes, our press passes. And by virtue of the press passes, we could literally get into any venue we wanted to get into. So we sat in the press seats and great, sat back. Whoa, this is fantastic, There's Maradona just in front of us. We absolutely thoroughly enjoyed it. I
can imagine. So who would have been, would the likes of Micheál O'Hare and Micheál Murray-Hertig, would they have taken you under their wing to some degree when you were starting out?
I can't say that was the case because we would have travelled in different directions. Micheál O'Hare would be working one place, I would be working another place. I think the only time I came across Micheál O'Hare, apart from doing All-Ireland finals when I was doing the one in Irish, would have been that 1980 season. I did the Connacht final that year and he was doing it as well. And I remember Micheál O'Hare going to the dressing rooms and he was looking to try and get into the dressing rooms to try and have a look at the Roscommon players who were about to play Mayo. Have I got this right? Was it? Yeah, it was. It was Roscommon against Mayo. That was the 1980 final. And he said, I won't know what they look like unless I can get in. So they very kindly let him in. I wouldn't have come across Micheál O'Hare that much before he was taken ill. But I do remember back in 1990 getting a telephone call from a group in West Cork who wanted to know if I would go down to a function where Micheál O'Hare was going to be the guest of honour, and would I say something about Micheál O'Hare. He had been taken ill in 1985, so I attended a function down there, and I spent about 10 minutes talking about Micheál O'Hare's career, and I got to talk to him briefly that night. He was the commentator when I was growing up. He had this most magnificent voice. He was especially strong on radio because that was where he developed and grew as a broadcaster. Television came afterwards. Where Micheál Murray-Hertig is concerned, well, of course, he's still around, thanks be to God, with us. He's a fabulous man. He's the most engaging person. I'll tell you one of the lovely things about Micheál. I was working on the Connacht final in 1994 between Mayo and Leitrim. This was the day that Leitrim won their first Connacht title since 1926 or 27. And I'm coming out of the ground and going towards the dressing rooms to get the interviews, and Micheál is with me. And a man comes up to him and says, Micheál Murray-Hertig. He wanted to shake his hand, which he did. And then he added the words, "You're everyone's friend." And I thought, wow, to be able to say you're everyone's friend, that was a lovely thing to be able to say about anybody. Fabulous guy. Fabulous.
An intoxicating voice as well. Are there other commentators that you really admire over the years or love their style?
Yeah, I grew up listening to an awful lot of radio when I was a child, and there was a commentator called Peter Jones, and Peter Jones was the main radio commentator for BBC Sport on 2 as it was then. Now it's Sport on 5, Radio 5 Live. He was the daddy of the whole lot. He was an absolutely brilliant commentator. If anybody wants to listen to Peter Jones in action, I would advise them going to YouTube, and there is a little piece there where Peter Jones does the summing up of a match that never happened. It was the day of the Bradford fire in England, when a lot of people lost their lives. And he has to sum it up in the post-match report for 5 Live. It is the most brilliantly constructed, most brilliantly spoken piece of radio reporting you're ever likely to listen to. Fabulous. The man later died. Ironically, he did everything under the sun in broadcasting. He eventually lost his life, got a heart attack while doing the boat race, of all things.
Wow, that's crazy. Because that Bradford one, that was a situation where there was an awful lot of rubbish over the course of years underneath the stands, and somehow it was ignited and it went up and a lot of people lost their lives, wasn't it? Yeah,
it was a timber stand, you know. I mean, in those days, you had a lot of disasters. You had Bradford, you had Heysel, you had, before all of that, back in the 70s, you had a major disaster as well in Ibrox in Scotland, when the crush barriers literally came down. A lot of people lost their lives tragically. Yes, sport suffered pretty heavy losses in the 70s into the 80s, unfortunately. After that, sport venues began to be taken desperately seriously by the health and safety people, and more seating arrangements came in, and you had to have all seating stands. Did I read somewhere or hear someone today where Manchester United have managed to get permission for a section of the Old Trafford ground to be a stand-only part, maybe for about 1,500 standing patrons? I think something like that was in the news today. It's an interesting change, an interesting development.
And do you ever long for the days when, you mentioned going into the dressing room in that Mayo and Roscommon game in the 1980s? It was so much different back then. You could, as a reporter, go straight down into the dressing room after the game, whereas these days that just doesn't happen at all.
No, I think the players deserve their privacy. I don't really want to be doing that. I do remember, for instance, in Croke Park nowadays, we can't any longer go even to the dressing rooms because they don't want us down there, and I can understand that. I'll tell you a funny little story and a quirky little story. In 2008, the All-Ireland football final that year was a rematch between Kerry and Tyrone, and Mickey Hart was then and still is the Tyrone manager. And Micheál O'Murhertig and myself went down to the dressing room door. We were allowed at that stage to get as far as the door. And the bus was coming in, bringing the Tyrone players. And we went up to Mickey and said, look, Mickey, are there any changes? And we showed him the match programme with the 15 players meant to start. And he says, I'll come back to you in a short while. And we stood outside. It was about 2:30, and around 3:20, true to his word, he came back out and he said, look, there are two changes. He's not playing and he's not playing, and these two are coming in their stead. And this fella, McMahon, I think it was one of the McMahons, Joe or Justin, is going to play in the full back line. I think two McMahons ended up playing in the full back line. And fair play to him. Very few managers, from my experience, have ever done that. Come out and being that helpful and giving that level of assistance on the day before, the day of an All-Ireland final,
Would you have had many people get upset? Like, in general, as you said, you just call what you see in front of you. But would you have ever had people come back to you later on and be quite upset with something that you said?
It doesn't happen too often, I'm glad to say. It doesn't happen too often. No, I think most players are big men and they know themselves if the pass they gave was a horrible pass, or if they've missed an open goal, or if a goalkeeper has dropped the ball. There's not an awful lot you can do about it, There really isn't. You can't camouflage it. It's sport. We just get on with it. It's a metaphor for life, ups and downs.
And then just I suppose to finish off, what are you looking forward to when things get back? Is there anything in particular you're longing for?
I'm looking forward to getting back to sitting amongst a crowd of people again, enjoying sport. I don't care what match it is. I'm dying to get back to see sport. But I think it's a bit trite for all of us to be discussing sport at this stage, because there is so much suffering going on in our country and everywhere else as well. And really, sport has got to take a back seat until this thing is all sorted out. I'm hoping against hope, Shane, naturally, that we will see some sport before the end of the year. They're talking now about 2021. I don't know. What I'm trying to figure out is, are they going to wait until there's a vaccine for this or a cure for this? God knows when that's going to come about. Or at what stage are we going to say, look, we've just got to go back, We can't be forever cocooning and in isolation. Some stage or other, we have to hope that the thing has vanished. And I'm longing for that day, but in the meantime, I hope that all of your viewers stay as safe as possible.
Absolutely. Well, you've been very good with your time, Ger, so best of luck to you and your family, and hopefully we'll see you behind the mic sooner rather than later.
You're very kind. Take care.